Last week, I took a car off of a racetrack and I felt a little bit like Richard Hammond, but with less damage and at lower speeds, because turns out when you try to power through a corner, it usually doesn't end up the way that you want. And do what you will with that information, but I did think that I may have probably had it. It was really close. It was like gonna be an oversteer control, and then voila, it was gone, and there was grass everywhere. Kind of like body kits. If you remember back in the day, body kits were all the rage. Like every Chevy Cavalier you could buy in 2010 had some form of ZZP looking ass bumper and some double cheeked up rear bumper that was way too soft for the rest of the body, and it made you feel like you needed to play Lil Jon any single time that you got into the car because it was probably your big brother's car. I'm Alex at Fine Instagram, and today we're gonna be talking about that thing that was on every single one of my Need for Speed Underground 2 cars. P.S. The 3000 GT was and still is my favorite. I have it on my computer and I play it for 2-week binges every single year. It was sick as and totally looked better than all of Dakota's if Dakota even actually played the game. Anyway, we're talking about the history of body kits and just why did they seem to disappear just as fast as they popped up in pretty much every single 2002 video game. I got a watch now that yells at me that I need to stand up and breathe. And apparently having 130 BPM when I'm sitting and talking isn't healthy. I don't know what that means, but okay. Welcome to Fitment Industries, where we got wheel slapping, tire loving, suspension having people to talk about cars on the old YouTube. And if you're interested in a bunch of wheel and tire packages on the website, you can check that out over at fitmentindustries.com. In addition to that, we also have suspension, things like coilovers, air suspension, and the like, and accessories and more. So if you're really looking at some sort of lug bolts, lug nuts, and things like that, we also have that going on as well. We also have something on the website that has a quick delivery icon, so you can get your wheels and tires shipped to you in as little as 7 days. And we've been doing that just because, and we're talking about it because the world is nuts, okay? And we wanted to just get you your wheels and tires faster so you don't have to wait for like 6 months. And we do have a new giveaway going on with Artisa ArtFormed Wheels, our very own wheel company. You can actually pick up one of these t-shirts and it helps us make a difference into the American Cancer Society. It's pretty exciting. Now let's talk about the polyurethane pumpers, the Duraflex deckers, the plastic puffers, the grill top cutters. Every single thing I just said makes me uncomfortable and the opposite of moist. But body kit history can trace back all the way to the mid-1950s and early 1960s. Essentially, you had two different types of body kit activities going on, those in the United States and those in Japan. The USDM market found themselves kind of lobbing off good chunks of their car panels for the single sake of making them faster in the desert straights. They'd cut their steelies, they'd flip them inside out, or they'd even go as crazy as to say that they would cut them and weld two wheels together to make a wider wheel, then slap a bigger tire onto their car, and then take off their fender so that it was lighter. But while a ton of people loved making their car look like a death couch with wheels, eventually people tried to make it so they didn't need to rip off fenders every single weekend to make their car lighter or faster, or maybe just look a little bit more aggressive. Ergo came the good old body kits. Performance companies were relatively new in the day, but they were trying to, in addition to motorsport engineering companies, to develop lightened body panels and exterior body modifications in hopes to bridge the gap between lightweight components, style, regulations, and professional racing, which was spawning into the world. And well, at top of all of that, honestly, it also looked really freaking dope. And the USDM market was really taking to it well. The Japanese market was a little bit different. With the Japanese market, you had that coming from the Bosozoku group of individuals more so in the 70s and 80s, especially with a lot of the motorcycle aesthetics and designs moving over into the car culture, essentially as the Bosozoku transitioned from the previous generation, from the 40s and 50s and the post-World War II veterans, into their children that they ultimately did have. You had people changing a lot of that aggressive styling from motorcycles over into cars, and a lot of regulations was passed with vehicles in Japan specifically relating around performance improvements, which meant that a lot of the Japanese car culture was much more focused on aesthetics, in addition to the fact that there was a lot of people in Japan that were really trying to find ways to express themselves because the country was more so known as fitting in. So you had a more aggressive body panel, body kit style world come out of the JDM or Japanese tuner culture than you did on the USDM side. Now, those body panels would begin to truly start making differences once the big boy brains started to learn that with proper design elements, air dams could be developed to improve engine cooling. Wow, that is so neat. You widened fenders allowed for wider regulatory wheels for racing, which was also pretty neat. These were new rules, so like if you just made the fender wider, you put bigger wheels. Lip splitters, diffusers, and more helped with pushing air down, up to the side, and smoother through the increased speed that was coming up in the automotive industry. Essentially, they started to change the car as close as they could if the regulatory issues and the fucking people with white wigs would allow them to, which was actually pretty neat. It spawned a lot of controversy with every single regulatory racing committee that existed in the 70s and 80s because people could just change the body panels, make cars wider, race them, and absolutely demolish. And with the USDM going at it from that degree and the Japanese going at it from this degree, you really started to have some very interesting styles and cultures getting to grow around this body kit thing. But people like you and people like me really didn't start getting eyes on it until a very different means, and that would be the old video games, all right? The good old couch potatoes, the things that your parents yelled at you for. Raise your hand if your parents told you video games are bad for you and rotted your brain. I learned more about macroeconomics and RuneScape than anything else in the world, and I will say that to my macro econ teacher, I don't give a care. Keep them raised if you're sitting too close to the TV and they said it was bad for your eyes. I remember that too. I remember when you got really close to the TV, you would feel a little static feeling, you could put your hand on it, and then you got yelled at for putting your hand on the TV because they thought the oil was gonna ruin it, whatever. That didn't stop me from grabbing my slim controller and blasting some classic Bored Too Slow or Static X until I was ready to whoop some NPC ass with my cars in Need for Speed, okay? And if you don't know that song, how do you not know that song? Just a little too slow! Games like LA Street Racing, Street Legal, Need for Speed Underground, Wang Gang, RPM Tuning, and even Grand Theft Auto San Andreas started to introduce body kit modification in the late 90s and early 2000s in their video games, which of course you just had to do in the game. And that introduced and influenced a lot of young automotive enthusiasts into the thought of doing that. Now, you're not gonna have a stock body in a video game, we all know that. When you can get the Armageddon TT kit in Need for Speed, which was god-awful now, but it was beautiful then when you were playing the game. I'm not entirely sure why everything in that game glowed so weird, like Need for Speed Underground 2, it had a lot of glow. If you ever looked at the game now, everything glowed for some reason. Anyway, the Vapor Kit was also awesome because it added side intakes with any actual intakes. If you ever look at some of the names of these kits that they had in the video games, they were atrocious. Life was good because eventually it made its way into real life. It really started to introduce itself into the community more for so everyday people. You had Mad Max style crazy stuff happening and more. Some big boy kits were getting copied, and they were the likes of like the Shogun, an introductory kit that was made by VEILSIDE in the mid 90s, which was built for their A80 Supra. That was eventually just copied in the USDM market, specifically with like Ford Mustangs, which is actually pretty interesting because a lot of these older authentic body kits were really coming through the way in the early 90s, and these video games were trying to replicate them in the early 2000s. You had a lot of people getting creative with trying to make body kits for every platform out there in the early 2000s. You had BOMEX, which began making the Civic community super excited through the use of like slightly widened flares, which was copied literally by anyone with the ability to make a mold. And lastly, you even had Blitz. And if you were my age, Blitz kits were everywhere, or at least rep Blitz kits were everywhere, because every Mitsubishi Eclipse had a fake Blitz kit on it. In Wisconsin specifically, nobody was paying authentic Blitz kit prices, okay? Don't lie to me, everyone bought a rep kit, it's just what you did. Andy Autosport, that was like where everyone went for a lot of these kits. But over time, and more specifically right into the early 2010s, these massive, bulging, beastly bumpers with uncomfortable amounts of creases and lines just kind of sort of got up and disappeared. Gone, okay, were the body kits, only to be replaced with over fenders and grass grill tops that were pretty much just cut to fit. So what exactly happened to body kits? Why did the backward doors disappear and the triple vented non-functional side skirts just dissipate from the world? Was it the fact that they were just ugly? No, well, we're here to find out, okay? In the early 2010s, there was a shift in interest, mostly because of the changing styles that were going away from a lot of the molded, widened fenders and just less of that stuff as a whole. The market was kind of changing, and with it, a lot of people's perceptions about the automotive community was changing with it as well, and it was changing incredibly fast. The introduction of the early 2000s sped up a lot of automotive culture and likes and styles and things like that because of the introduction and the widespread gain of the World Wide Web. But body kits began a chunk of their historical decline after car manufacturers were really starting to get the hang of what enthusiasts wanted. Remember, the early 2000s were a jumping board for a lot of people loving sports cars, and people started adding wide arches and sloped nose and wide tail lights out of the manufacturer's pocket. You had cars like the Hyundai Genesis, the 350Z, the G Series, the M Series, and more starting to make their way into mass production, and with the initial need for the same wide dump trucks of a rear end, they just weren't as prevalent as a lot of their previous generation narrow-bodied cars. They were able to start making some wide boys that you really didn't need fender flares for anymore. The USDM was still playing around with a lot of body kits, and you had things like the D3 CTSV kit, but even with auto communities, they were starting to lean into how smooth you can make the whole build look with air suspension and ride height versus body kits and backward doors and more aggressive fender flares. They were starting to just get away from the fact that it looked too bubbly. And with the introduction of the World Wide Web, essentially it sped all of this up. Instead of things taking 20 years to kind of fade in and fade out, it faded in like 5. And I know I keep talking about backwards doors, but that was a thing. And unless you have an RX-8, backward doors, I'm not sure if they're ever gonna come back. Or you have like an old school Cadillac or Lincoln, in which case that's super cool. Good guy RX-8, good guy Lincoln, good guy old school Cadillac. XB even had fender flares. The 370Z had wider arches. The Corvette of the early it had fender, they all were flared fenders. People were starting to manufacturers, they're slow, but they ain't that slow, okay? It was an OE fender flare kind of business. And a lot of the businesses supporting these wide variety of fender replica businesses also started to wane along with them. Essentially, when you have less fakes out there in the automotive industry, you have less overall cars that had oddball wide body kits on them. Essentially, the amount of suppliers waned and kind of came down a little bit from the early 2000s because they just couldn't keep up with the times. And it just wasn't as expected over time. And let's be honest, there's a few kits coming from big boy brands that plenty of us don't really understand what's going on. And it's not to say that they're an excellent company, they just make some weird stuff. The excessive polyurethane and headlight changing kits just aren't in anymore, as more as people revert back to a more simplified look, or a look that still retains the OE design elements of the manufacturer. And that's the final big piece as to why you don't see a lot of body kits anymore. The car scene has adapted. While over fenders and some body kits are still out there, it's not as massively reflective in the industry right now. People prefer to kind of keep the heart or body of these cars with some piece of resemblance of their stock counterpart, whereas back in the day, in the early 2000s, the late 1990s, and even into the 1980s, going hard in the paint could mean an entirely different front and rear end. It could mean changing the entire look of the car without you even knowing what the car was to begin with. It was a way more excessive, crazy out there idea. And now a lot of it has kind of reined back. But what do you think about body kits, and at what point do you remember them being a big thing or not so much of a big thing? Let us know in the comment section below, and of course, if you're looking for aftermarket wheels, tires, or suspension, be sure to hit us up over at fitmentindustries.com, and if you have an idea on what you'd like us to see covered next, be sure to drop it in the comment section below. I know there are still wide body kit companies out there. We're not saying that they're not. We're just saying that if you were to go back in time about 21 years, you'd see about 180 of them. And nowadays, if you go look out there, you're gonna see about 6. Let us know what you think, and of course, we'll talk to you later. Peace.